Thank you for joining us. My name is Debbie and I'm with the Cook County Farm Bureau, and our commodities and marketing team is sponsoring this Lunch and Learn webinar. This is just one of several that we've done this year as well as last year, in addition to many of the programs that we do here in-house. But obviously with certain health concerns, we have turned a little bit more to some of these Lunch and Learn. So it is a Lunch and Learn. If you brought your lunch, feel free to eat. Before I make introductions, just a couple of housekeeping rules. We're going to ask that everybody mute their microphone. So on the bottom left of your screen should be that microphone, and we're going to ask that you just click on it so that you see that red little microphone. I'll do mine as an example. And that is to keep out background noises for distractions. So Mike, if you can go ahead and mute yourself. Dan, Mixley, hello Mixley. If you can go ahead and get yourselves muted. Okay, thank you. A couple of other things is in the chat box. I do have one for Mike. He can't get his sound up. Mike, one of the examples that I would do is if you can't get the volumizer on your computer turned up, so try to go to your speakers. You might also want to go on your microphone is a cute little button right above next to the mute microphone, and then there's audio settings, and make sure that your speaker is corrected. Select your microphone. If that doesn't work, leave the meeting and log back in, because you can join us at any time. That's my suggestion. Okay. Also, I am going to this is being taped so we can send it out. Other thing is in that chat box, if everyone can find it on the bottom, you are free to go ahead as the presentation is going through to, if you have a question, go ahead and put your question in there so that we make sure that we get to it. If you need to be asked something right away, feel free to raise your hand, turn on your microphone, and go ahead and interrupt. So without any further ado, we'd like to thank you for being here. And I do want to turn this Lunch and Learn over to Ellen Phillips, who is to, I don't know where she is on your screen, but she is to my left on my screen. Ellen is a member of the commodities and marketing team, but she is retired after 25 years of being a University of Illinois extension educator. Wow, that's awesome. Ellen currently teaches and consults in the area of organic production, good agricultural practices, soil management, manure management, composting, as well as an array of other gardening types of questions. So today, composting for homeowners. Let's turn it over to Ellen. Thank you so much. And if I've forgotten anything, please let me know.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I will try and answer the questions in the chat box as we go along. And if you put it there and I don't get to it during the presentation, as I said, we'll just hang on afterwards and make sure those questions get answered. So thank you. I appreciate being invited to do this. Let me share my screen so we have some information to look at. Okay. Here we go. So today's topic is composting, a topic that always gets a lot of interest, which is great because we do need to be recycling and reusing our materials in this world. So today's topic, we only have about 30 minutes, so it's going to be a brush over of a lot of information. And certainly if you have questions afterwards, feel free to text me, call me, whatever. Start off with just an explanation what composting is, why everyone should be composting, the benefits of it to the soil, and a few tips on how to be successful in composting. And then once you have the compost, how to use that. So composting itself is simply taking a natural process called decomposition, where bacteria, fungi, and other things transform any organic materials that fall on the surface of the soil, like leaves, etc., and get transformed into soil organic material or matter, and that gets incorporated into soil aggregates, and it's a really good beneficial material to have for gardening. So composting itself is where we take that natural process, and try and speed it up by making everything in optimum conditions. And the other benefit of it is that it generally reduces those materials down by about 70%. So it's a much smaller volume than that you're dealing with as far as yard waste. When I talk about speeding that pile up, what we're really trying to do is keep the little microbes very happy within that compost pile. In a natural system, you do have those organic materials like grass clippings and leaves and so forth that fall on the surface, and the roots will die in plants. And so those are these organic materials that then we have bacteria and fungi that basically decompose that material. We also tend to have in our natural soils larger critters of mites and roly-polies and all the rest that take the larger leaves and just scratch them and break them apart to make it easier for the bacteria to decompose that. So there's a life cycle within soil that's always living and helps us decompose materials naturally. In a compost pile, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to basically keep these bacteria and fungi very happy with a lot of food until they've used it all up. And that means we probably have finished compost. First thing you got to know is that because we're in the urban area, is there may be some municipal codes that you need to be aware of. Every municipality is different. So all I've done here is list a few things that you might run across when you check with your city or town. Things that tend to be in these codes are that the compost bin usually has to be freestanding, which also means usually not up against a building, a shed, that kind of thing. Oftentimes there's a size limit. In this case, one of the codes was that it had to be 125 cubic feet and no bigger, taller than 5 feet. That's a really big compost pile. Other things, generally you're not allowed to have more than 3 compost bins on a property. You also have to be very mindful of not attracting rodents. You also cannot let it go anaerobic, which means it will smell. We'll talk about how to prevent that. Also, sometimes you are only allowed to put landscape waste, which means technically you can't put like kitchen scraps and that kind of thing officially in your pile. And we'll talk about those kinds of things as well a little bit later. Oftentimes there is a limit as to where it can go on your property. Normally it's your backyard. And I know in the city I live in, it has to be 15 feet away from the property line. So just check with your city and figure out what the codes are, and hopefully you can meet those so you can compost in your backyard. Well, in composting, there's 4 basic stages. One is we've got to create that pile of compost with all the things that we have. And then we are going to let that compost pile decompose those materials and try and keep those bacteria and so forth happy when that happens. Once most of that is decomposed, we're going to cure the compost, which means get it ready for use. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how to actually use that compost. So that's where we're headed off. So the first thing is to create that pile. And there are some essentials in composting. Creating that pile, we need to look at the volume of the pile, the materials that can go in, and then that surface area, the amount of area the bacteria can grow on. Once we have that, we'll worry about those conditions in a few slides on how to keep the bacteria happy. So the other thing about composting is that there's basically 2 different ways to compost. One we would call cold or passive composting. And that generally is where you just simply have a pile of organic materials. You might add some soil. You might turn it every few months or not at all. But it is a natural process. So all that material is eventually going to decompose. And that's fine. It just takes much longer. It might take up to a year to have those materials decompose. So that's what we call cold or passive composting. Biggest thing on this, we have to be really careful about what we put into the pile. You don't want to add things like weed seeds that don't get killed in a cold compost system. no materials that have diseases on them should be put into the compost system. So there are a few restrictions to try and not have a problem with the compost later. The other kind of compost would be called hot or active composting. And there, officially, and from an organic standard standpoint, there are some official things that have to happen. And that would be that the temperature of the pile on the inside of it needs to hit a temperature of 130 to 170 for at least 3 days once it's been turned. And it needs to be turned at least 5 times during the time that that pile is composting. Normally, if you can keep all the conditions right, you can turn around compost in about 6 to 8 weeks. My experience in 30 years of teaching about composting and composting myself is that homeowners don't always have all the perfect conditions. And so do expect that that compost pile may take a couple of months or more to actually decompose. That's not a problem. It will still decompose and be beneficial material for you to use. So how to make a perfect compost pile? If you look at all the books, it says that the compost pile itself needs to be about 1 cubic foot, which means 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. And there's some reasons for that. If it's smaller than that, generally the pile will not generate enough heat from the bacteria to encourage a lot of bacteria so that they decompose things fast. If it's too large, it's probably going to prevent air from getting into the center of the pile, and then you will have problems with it going anaerobic and smelling and those kinds of things. So in general, homeowners especially prefer to have it about a cubic yard. You go to a large composting facility, you'll see massive hills of compost, but they have machines to turn that every single day that we at home don't necessarily have. So, well, what is a bin? There's a lot of different ways to describe a bin. Your code, municipality code might have restrictions on what kind of bin you can use. You can use just about anything to make a bin though. Bricks are a natural. What is important to try and get some air. Sometimes you can put pallets underneath or just leave openings in there. They don't have to be this structured as well. I went to a garden walk, probably 10 years ago, and I loved what they had done because they actually put the compost piles at several locations throughout their garden. So they weren't walking across the yard every single time. So anytime they weeded, they just threw the things in there. And I thought that made a lot of sense, especially if you've got a lot of gardens. There's always opportunity to build a wooden structure for your compost bin. Pallets are definitely the cheapest. You can go really fancy and creating your own. If you do simply a search for compost structures, you'll see lots of instructions and diagrams and so forth how to build these on your own. For the most part, as long as they fit that 3 by 3 foot pile, it's good for composting. Not all compost piles need a roof or a cover on them. The only time that's really suggested is if the pile is within 150 feet of, say, a stream or river. As you can imagine, if a rainstorm hits and there's drainage off that compost pile, that's carrying nutrients. And we do not want those to get into our water streams. So that would be the only time we have to worry about a cover for that. If you don't want to build anything, there's lots of containers that you can purchase. All of them work generally very well. I'm not endorsing any one necessarily. If you don't like a lot of labor, then these balls or turners work generally very effectively. The biggest problem with all of these is that they don't hold a lot of material. And so for the most part, what you're doing here is cold composting. Again, nothing wrong with that. It will decompose. It would just be a slower process, and you have to be careful what you put into the bin. If you don't have any restrictions for having to have a bin, then you can have simply a pile of material on your backyard, and that is a cubic yard, and that's fine. You don't have to have a structure per se, and particularly if you are going to physically turn that pile, it oftentimes is easier to do that, so you don't have to lift up and over structures to get it into the next bin. If you don't have much material, and one of the problems with a lot of homeowners is that a cubic foot of material is like a season's worth of material. And most of us don't have that much. So one other easy way to not necessarily compost, but help things get decomposed faster is to do what we call a pit or trench method. And that's just simply dig a hole, put the materials in there, cover it up, and it will decompose into the soil, no problem. The next thing that you can use is something that is called the Seattle green cone. It's just one example I'm putting up there. They call it like a solarizer unit, but it simply has a cone at the top. It's open at the bottom. You can see where critters can go in and out. So any kitchen scraps, weeds, and so forth you put into that, and the animals take it out into your garden area. It works quite effectively. You can also make your own worm tower or worm tubes or purchase them. An easy way to do that is simply a PVC pipe with the bottom half having holes dug into it or drilled into it so the animals can get in and out. And again, you're done with dinner or cleaning up your kitchen, those scraps will go into that tube and those guys will take it out and eat it. And it's not, again, these work for homes that you don't have a lot of materials to make an actual compost pile. So, but if you do have enough materials to make a compost pile, then how do you make that? And what do you got to put in it? If you look in books, general instructions say that you need to have about 6 to 12 inches of organic materials. And we'll talk about what those are in a little bit, but you know, leaves, grass clippings, that kind of thing. Put those on in the bin, and then you're going to add about 1 inch of soil. This is very important because you're introducing that bacteria and fungi and so forth that are going to do the decomposition, and they will multiply and occupy that whole compost bin. So about 1 inch of soil after each of those layers. If the materials you put in are basically leaves, very high in carbon, then you might have to also add a source of nitrogen. And we'll talk about why for that in a little bit. You can add nitrogen fertilizer, something like urea, to that, or you can use horse manure, something like that, to add that nitrogen source. And then you would just do layer after layer after layer. My only experience with all of this is that most homeowners don't get 6 to 12 inches of organic material at any one time. So in your bin, I guess my recommendation is anytime you are adding material, try and incorporate that fresh material into the pile and just keep adding soil along with it so that it's already decomposing before you get a finished pile. As far as what to put in, there's just a lot of options when we talk about yards. A general rule of thumb was that you want like 1 garbage can full of brown, which are your high carbon materials. Those would be things like leaves or straw, shredded paper that has a soybean-based ink. All those things can be put into a compost pile as a brown material. That would be matched then with 2 parts, say 2 garbage cans full of green material. And those are high nitrogen materials. They are going to help that pile decompose quickly. So things like your grass clippings, any kitchen scraps, coffee grinds, all of your weeds that you collect from your yard. Do be careful with perennials, especially if you pulled up the root. You want to make sure those are actually dried before you put them into the compost pile. But anything green usually will compensate. And by doing that proportion of 1 to 2, you generally are going to maximize the carbon to nitrogen ratio that bacteria need in order to have enough energy to multiply and enough protein from the nitrogen to build cells and so forth. So that ratio is pretty important. It will slow down the pile if we can't keep that fairly well matched. If you have a large amount of material, the large scale composters I've worked with, they actually weigh this, measure it, and they make this really accurate before they create those huge piles because they want things to heat up very quickly. So focusing on this is important, but don't let that science throw you off and not compost. Anything you put into that compost pile will eventually decompose. So although this can be important, it's not critical. Cold composting, it doesn't matter nearly as much. The surface area can make a difference because it will give the bacteria and fungi a lot of room to multiply on, and that's what we want, so that the pile heats up fast. So the smaller the pieces we can put in, generally the better. So we want things like pieces of wood and that kind of thing to be at most about 1 inch in size. The smaller diameter, then the faster that's going to decompose. Sometimes if we put larger things into the compost pile and the compost is cured, sometimes we'll find sticks and stuff in that still. You just throw them back into the original, the next compost pile, and they will continue to decompose a second compost pile. But if you have a shredder, grinder, if you can mow up the leaves to chop them before you put them in the compost pile, all those things increase that surface area and will speed up the compost. So once you have that material and the soil in that pile, the one thing I find with homeowners is we get impatient and we don't want to wait. Compost will take a couple of months to decompose. And if we keep adding materials, then it never really finishes and cures for us to be actually able to use it. So once you have that cubic foot of material, don't add anything to it. Start a brand new pile so that that material can decompose over time, and eventually we're going to get this great compost that we can then apply to our gardens. And so that's how we curate the pile. The next step then is trying to keep all those things happy. So we'll talk about what happens in that decomposition process. The conditions that we need to work at and keep on top of would be things like the amount of air in the pile, how much moisture, and then the temperature of that pile. So moisture is important. We generally want the compost pile to be about the moisture of a damp sponge. Easiest way to tell that is simply grab a handful of it and squeeze it. If it feels like a damp sponge, it's moist. So in the spring, we might actually have to cover it because it's going to get too wet. And if it gets too wet, there's not enough air in the pile and it will start to smell. And you just got to monitor the rain for that. In August, right now, outside of the rain we had last week, generally you're going to have to add water. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're figuring out where to put your compost pile. You want a hose maybe, so you don't have to carry buckets of water. Maintaining the moisture is really important because bacteria, fungi live in water. And so they have to have that film around that organic material in order to chomp on it and decompose it. So the moisture, we've got to keep track of and on top of it. Aeration is fairly easy if we have that cubic yard because the bacteria in the center of the pile, when they multiply and are decomposing material, create heat. And that center of the pile is going to be hot. And it will actually then act like a convection oven and draw cool air from the bottom as the hot air rises out of that pile. And so if you see steam coming off your pile, don't worry about it. That's actually a good thing. You have enough moisture and it's heating up and you're going to have hot compost. If we don't have enough convection, or if you want to speed up the pile and the decomposition process, another way to do that is to simply turn the pile. You do that for two reasons. One is to get that fresh air into the center of the material, but more importantly is we're going to watch the temperature as well. When the temperature cools down, it means bacteria is out of food. And so we have to mix the pile to give them some fresh material in the center of the pile. So you can just use a pitchfork, something else, to move the material from one bin to the next. There are really cool turners available anymore that work very efficiently. You just stick it in and twist it and it turns it enough to create some air at the center of that pile. Well, other reasons we need to turn the pile are because there's a bad odor. And that means the pile has gotten too wet, not enough air, and it goes anaerobic, which means decomposing with no air. And those bacteria at that point create a sulfur odor. So it's going to smell like rotten eggs. If that happens, not a big deal. Just mix up the pile, get some air back into it, and that odor will be gone in 24 hours. The other reason I said we're watching temperature, especially for hot composting, is because that's telling us the bacteria are working. So we do want to watch that. If we turn the compost regularly, that temperature will be maintained and the heat will be maintained. If you turn the pile even like every 3 days, as our large scale composters do, it will decompose much faster than if you're only out there turning it once a month, or even slower if you're like me. Right now, I'm very busy. Once a year is my composting style, and everything decomposes. So, but temperature, as I said, is important. So we want to maintain the optimum temperature, if at all possible, at about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the bacteria will do that if they're living and growing and so forth. Most compost piles range from like 55 degrees in winter when they're coming out as winter in the spring and just starting up, to about 160. Much above 160, we also want to turn it to cool the pile down. And that's very, very rare. But much above 160, the beneficial bacteria will not be working. So it is important to try and keep it around 140 degrees, 150 max. So the way to tell temperature is you can purchase a compost thermometer. It's a couple feet long. They're usually about $30 to $60, depending on where you get them. And that will tell you the temperature pretty easily. The other way is that most of us would not want to put our hand into an oven that's 140 degrees. So if you just dig a hole into the center of the pile, put your hand in there, and you don't want to keep it in there, it's probably hot enough. And that is still actively composting. If it's cooling down where it's not as much, it's about 120 degrees, that's when you turn it. It means the bacteria are running out of food. And so we do need to actually shift the material around, give them more food, make sure there's moisture, and that pile will heat right back up to 140 degrees within a couple of hours. It's amazing how fast that happens. So those are how we create the pile and the critical things we need to look at. After you've turned that pile a few times and the temperature goes back and up and down between 140 degrees, then it's time to cure that pile. And so we are going to turn it several times, and eventually we're going to get to the point where the temperature basically stays at that 120 degrees, or where we can keep our hand close to the center of that pile. And at that point, it should also look like compost, which we'll talk about in a second. At that point, we're just going to let the pile sit. And the reason for this is that in the organic decomposition process, there are a lot of volatile acids and other things that can harm plants if we put fresh compost into our soil. By letting it cure, those things will be deactivated and decomposed. The other benefit is that we have fungi taking over, because they like cooler temperatures. Fungi have these little arms called hyphae. They go in and they sort of bind the materials together. And that's how we end up with compost looking very similar to soil. So for curing, most importantly, just let it set. You do have to keep track of it though. If it gets wet, it may go on anaerobic. You don't want that. That creates those volatile acids. You're going to have to turn it. You also don't want to have it get recontaminated. So you might want to cover it so that weed seeds and that kind of thing don't get into it. And when you're done, as I said, depending on the temperature, and once it cools down and below 100, it's definitely cured well enough. The compost itself is going to look great. It usually is dark brown, very loose, crumbly, humus-like material. You shouldn't see sticks and that kind of thing in there. If you do, you can take them out and throw them back into the other compost pile you've got. The best thing is that you have reduced that volume significantly. So it's a couple of buckets of compost you're going to get out of that cubic yard of materials that you start with. It should also smell good. Actinomycetes, that are one of the microbes in that composting process, create that nice earthy smell that you, if you dig in your soil in the spring, you smell, and it just is very recognizable as soil of good quality. The other thing you can do to make sure that that compost is composted long enough and cured long enough is to do one of two tests. You have a bag test, easy, just take a plastic bag, put some compost into it, seal it for a couple days, open it up. If it smells nice and fresh, like that soil, you're good to go. If it smells a little rotten or acidy, that pile needs to compost a little bit longer. Put that soil back, that compost back in the pile, let it cure, and a week or so again, try it again. Another test that you can do is that cucumber seeds are particularly very sensitive to volatile acids. And so just take a cup of the compost, put a couple of cucumber seeds in, they germinate quite quickly. And within a few days, if you've got cucumbers growing, then go for it. The compost is ready. If they are not going to germinate, again, let it cure for a little bit until that compost is cured totally. So now you got great compost. Hopefully your efforts during the summer come to fruition, and there's a few ways to use this. You can use it, my favorite way is simply as a soil amendment. Anytime I'm preparing the vegetable garden, mix in about 2 inches of the compost, and it is best usually in something like a vegetable garden or a perennial garden you're putting in starting, is to mix that into the soil, about 4 to 6 inches. The other way, if you have perennial beds and you just want to get compost worked into the soil, earthworms, roly-polies, all those guys are going to help you. If you use it as a mulch on the surface, those guys will take that organic material and bring it down into the soil. So this kind of mulch will not last a whole season a lot of times. You can actually do this and then put wood chips or something else on top if you wanted to, but it is a good way to use your compost as well without much effort. Never use more than about 4 inches because then you're making a really good home for things like moles and so forth. And keep it away from the trunk of trees. You could use it in a raised bed. The soil going into a raised bed usually is about 30 to 50% compost originally. Every year it's best to add about a ½ inch to inch of compost to add new nutrients and organic material into that raised bed soil to maintain fertility. And then lastly, you can use it as a lawn top dressing rather than fertilizing. It really works well. Oftentimes we recommend doing that after you have core aerated. That's a machine you can rent. It takes cores out, throws the cores on the surface of the soil. It just creates more airspace for the grass roots to grow. And if you apply the compost after you core aerate, it usually will end up in the holes and be an easier place for those roots to grow. Really will freshen up a lawn very quickly. Landscapers can do this for you too with a professional amount of professional machine that cores and applies compost if you don't have enough of your own. But it is a good way to fertilize the lawns. So as I said, only had a few minutes, so tried to give you the best scope of composting. It can be easy, especially cold composting. Can be fun, to especially have some really great compost at the end to put into your gardens. And it is definitely the ultimate recycling program for our organic waste. A couple of other comments I just want to make though is that oftentimes when people get into composting, they realize, gosh, I really don't have time for this, or you don't have enough materials sometimes to compost, but you want compost for your garden. So I just want to make you aware that you can purchase compost by the truckload. Most landscapers can help you access that. There is the U.S. Composting Council that if you go on their website, they will point you to the professional large-scale composters that you can contact directly to have a truckload or something delivered to your property. The other thing is, don't feel guilty if you don't compost. If you've got all those bags of yard waste, not a problem. Those yard waste by law have to go to one of these guys to compost. And so if you're still recycling, it's just you're not doing the work. So great that you're recycling in that way. Either way it really helps the environment. So with that, I will answer any chat questions. For some reason, my chat window did not come up.
I'd be happy to read them for you. So
Sure.
I'll start with just the questions. And first, just so that everybody knows, first of all, Ellen, thank you so much. I'm still daunted by the idea of doing it, but it is something on my to-do list. So we'll see if I do. In the meantime, let's see, Dean asked, so if city codes allow raised bins / containers, then it would be cold and take up to a year, correct?
The containers may not take up to a year, especially sometimes, especially those raised containers and so forth. You could almost do like a vermicomposting and purchase some red wiggler worms and put them in that bin, and that will increase that how fast that compost. But yeah, usually those purchase bins are just too small to heat up, so you are going to cold compost. So do be really careful. Don't put live perennials, roots in there. No weed seeds at all, if possible. And no kitchen scraps, no pet waste. It's another question we often get. No dog or cat manure going into the compost bin. Those animals are meat eaters, and they tend to have parasites that can transfer to us. And unless you're really doing an excellent job of hot composting, those parasites are not killed off in a normal composting system. So do not put pet waste in there, hot or cold.
Okay, thank you. Another one, it said from Dean, it sounded like this, Ellen said to make it and then let it sit. Would you, what do you know about, or how do you handle the adding of kitchen scraps on a daily or a regular basis?
My point is that once you have that cubic yard of material, if you want it to decompose to the point you can get to cure it, you really can't add anything else, because every time you put fresh material in, it's going to be decomposing at a different rate. So that new kitchen scraps or new weeds from the garden should start a brand new pile. And that's why oftentimes when you see books, there are 3 piles and different progressions of time those piles have started and where they are in the decomposition process. And you can truly let it sit unless it gets anaerobic, or you do have to be careful. We are an urban area, and so you can potentially get mice in there. You can get rodents in there. And so even in my backyard, rather static piles, I will try at least once a month to at least go and loosen it up so that the mice don't think it's a great home. Anytime you move that around, that will disturb their home if they choose to try and live there.
Thank you. Danielle said, I think you already answered this, but for kitchen scraps, what is not to be used? And when can I use grass clippings if I fertilize the lawn?
All right. Kitchen scraps. Any vegetable generally is good. The 2 things that we generally, and most municipalities will actually put these in the rules, is to not use any meat leftovers in the compost. They will decompose if you put them in, but they will attract your raccoons, opossums, etc., and become a nuisance. So that's the main reason we don't put them in a backyard composting system. In a large scale, we do that all the time, not a problem. The other thing is anything with a lot of oil or grease, butter, or oil, things like even orange peels, lemon peels and so forth have a lot of oil in them. And oil is something that bacteria don't decompose really well. And as a result, if you have a lot of that in the pile, it will slow down the decomposition process or even prevent it if everything's covered in oil. So generally, we do not recommend putting those in. Orange peels, those kinds of things, if you put them in, You will probably see them at the end of the first composting cycle. You take them out, you throw them back into the next composting bin, and eventually they do get decomposed. But it's a little bit more work to do that. Grass clippings, good point. A fertilizer generally is never an issue as far as utilizing those grass clippings in a compost system. The only concern is if you are using herbicides to control weeds. And even that for homeowners, it's not that much of a concern. But if you have a professional landscaper spraying your lawn or applying chemicals, some of those chemicals can be much more what we call persistent, which means they are designed to hang around for a month or 2 or 3 in order to kill off the new weed seeds that are starting to grow. If that gets into the grass clippings and into the compost pile, even a hot compost pile, will not degrade those fast enough. That if you then take that compost and put it, say, into your vegetable garden, I want to grow lettuce, it's also going to kill your lettuce seeds. So if you have a professional landscaper, ask them what herbicides they're applying. You should know that anyway. It really should be in your contract what they're using. And ask them how persistent it is and whether it's safe to use the grass clippings in a compost pile. Most landscapers, because it's been, we've known about this now for about 8 or 10 years, usually are very cautious about that. But not everybody gets trained the right way. So just ask the questions, and they should be able, legally, they should provide that information for you.
Great answer. Okay, let's see. We have Mike O'Brien said the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in Stickney has piles of it free, but may not be good for edible plants or veggies? Question mark.
Yeah, and there's a possibility for that. They do a lot of testing, so they would know what is or isn't acceptable at that site. They have various grades of compost. Professionally composted material is graded for A to D compost, and where that compost can then be used. If they are giving it to a homeowner, I mean, you can ask and verify with them that it can be used in a vegetable garden, but generally it's considered okay. If you are at all concerned, then don't do that. But still, that biomass compost is really excellent for things like trees and ornamentals and so forth that are not going to be affected or come close to vegetables and that kind of thing. So, oh, Debbie, I can't hear you.
Yep, sorry, my phone is going crazy. Sorry about that. This is from Danielle. What do you think about worm composters that you can buy for under the kitchen sink?
They're great, especially if kids. Kids absolutely love them. You do have to be careful with them. You want to make sure you create the bin correctly with screens and over all of the holes so that the worms can't get out. My son forgot to keep the lid on one night, and we had a really fun morning picking up all the worms in my kitchen because they can crawl. You have to be careful how you put the food in. It always has to be covered, or you can end up with fruit flies and that kind of thing. And the last thing you really need to know is that you need to use purchased and or friend got red wiggler worms. Those are worms that are much more adapted to our warmer temperatures, 70 and 80 degrees in a house, rather than cold soils. Our soil-based earthworms really prefer temperatures in the 50s and 60s. And that's why in the summer, like right now, you won't see them very close to the surface. They're usually further down unless you've got a lot of organic matter there. So actually, if you go to the University of Illinois website and do a search for Herman the worm and look for instructions on how to build Herman's home, they have an instruction, a really easy instruction on how to build a vermicomposting system just out of a plastic tub. Or you can buy a lot of the wormeries. There's some really beautiful wormeries now that go inside and or outside in your yard. So.
Right, thank you. This one is from Phyllis, what about preen? P-R-E-E-N, preen.
Yeah, that's a herbicide. That is a persistent herbicide. And so if you are using that I mean, you wouldn't use that on your lawn, and generally I would not be that concerned about it. I just don't think you're going to get enough of, even if you pull up roots of weeds, that would affect the compost necessarily. But that is a persistent herbicide, so you might be able to take a word of caution and just be careful how you use that soil in a compost pile.
Okay, let's see here. There's another one from Dorothy. What do you do with the worm bins when the soil gets too wet? The best way to dry it out. And before you answer, everyone, you're free to unmute yourselves, turn on your videos, and you know, ask Ellen your question. But if you prefer to type, that works as well. So again, from the Rosiers, what do you do with the worm bins when the soil gets too wet? What's the best way to dry it out?
I'm assuming you're talking about the wormery or vermicomposting. If that's the case, the material that goes into those bins is paper. So you just add more paper. If it's really moist at the bottom, then that usually means it's time to clean the bins out. And again, on Herman's website, there's instructions on how to clean the bin so that you can collect the worms and get the vermicompost out of the bin. If you are talking about a large scale, your backyard composting system, if it's too wet, you really do have to get in with a pitchfork or something and turn that, or at least loosen it up to get some air to the center of that pile so it doesn't start to smell.
Did you say for papers, Alan, was it only a specific type of paper? Like newspapers, or can it be magazines? Can it be your junk mail that you may shred as well?
What you want to do is try and keep it limited to soybean-based inks kind of paper. So a good portion of the printer companies now use soybean-based ink in your home printers. Newspapers are almost all soybean-based ink. Any of those inserts with a lot of color or shiny paper would not be something that you want to use. But if it's white and has black on it, oftentimes a good portion of the time that's fine. Do your own little research on that and just make sure that the ink is soybean-based, not an oil product. So.
Okay, any other questions?
You do have my email, so anytime you need that, just let me know. Got my email, call, or Debbie knows got my phone number, and I'd be glad to answer any of your questions.
And what I did say is that once the recording's available, we're going to go ahead and send out a program evaluation and a copy of the recording. Oh, we do have one from Mike. It says, I use the paper egg containers from Aldi, tear them up and add them and layer them in. Good advice.
Yes, not a problem. That's cardboard. That's cardboard. So.
Okay. So I know where I live, there is so much wildlife because I am right next to the forest preserve. So that is my biggest concern about doing this right now. It's not, I have plenty of space, plenty of stuff. So my neighbor does it, but he's had issues. So
yeah. No, I mean, yeah, somebody asked about kitchen scraps. So if you put eggshells in your compost pile, an opossum will find them. So they will come, and especially if it's not a durable plastic, it's amazing what they can get through. So
I saw at the beginning though, you had some of those creative ones. So the tubes that go down in.
Yeah, those are very easy to work. They really work nicely. Especially if you don't have a large garden, you just have a little bit of material. And the nice part about those also is you can put them throughout your yard. So you don't have to walk a long distance if you're just putting the weeded materials in those. So, and again, if you have an active live soil, it really is amazing how fast those earthworms and roly-polies and all those other guys will come in and grab that stuff, and they would, take it out into the soil. So.
Okay, let's see. Does Cook County only allow one composter? I have 5 going, so don't tell the composter police. Okay. I'm just gonna say, we're not a governmental organization, and honestly, we have no idea. So to us, you would have to probably check with your local municipality and go to their website and look online. It's kind of like beekeeping. It is different for everybody. There's no one standard thing. Ellen?
I guess that my only recommendation is be to actually call and ask, because I've given this presentation and numerous municipalities, and when I'm in a specific town, I will call and try or find that information on the web, and oftentimes it's not there or it's buried in the code. So just call the community development office and just say, what are the rules for composting? Because you don't want to be fined. When I first moved into my town 20 years ago, composting was not a big thing, and my neighbor didn't know what I was doing. I got reported, and the fine they wanted to impose was rather significant until I explained that I'm a soil scientist and this is actually a good thing. And now they're very avid composting. So, the time changes good things.
Educate your neighbors.
They turned out to be good neighbors. So.
Mike also said, I use PVC piping drilled with holes like chimneys. That's Ellen, you had that.
Yeah,
sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome.
They're quite effective. A little bit wider is better than the, just like you want like a 4 or 6 inches probably better, but it's what do you want in your yard and how they fit in. So.
Final questions. Okay, then on behalf
Great questions. Thank you.
On behalf of the Cook County Farm Bureau, Ellen, thank you so much. That was wonderful. And to you, thank you for taking the time out during your day and lunch and learn with us. And again, I will be forwarding a program feedback form. We really appreciate that, along with the recording once available. Thank you so much, all, for joining us. Have a great day.